Thanks, Stefan. Welcome back, everyone. I know it was a quick break, but this afternoon session is going to cover, as we just said, the long-term housing models. And again, please participate in the chat through your questions and any kind of input or insight or experience. We do want to make sure that in the next couple of hours, there's going to be a lot of talking out. But we also want to make sure that we're engaging with you and breaking up that kind of presentation only mode. So I encourage you to use your chat function, both in Brand Live, which is in the bottom right of your screen, and through Slido as well, which you could scroll to under this main presentation screen. So with that, let's get going. Can you give us the next slide, please, Stefan? Again, recap of this morning. Earlier, we looked at those short-term housing models, taking a look at emergency rental assistance and kind of working through all that means in terms of how it interfaces with maybe some of the other funding sources that are out there. We talked a lot, and there was a lot of interest in the SRO concept, and then some interest in tiny houses as well, though, as we stated, there is some discussion, conversation around what that looks like and what it means. Repurposed hotels, certainly we have models for it, and there was some interest in finding out more. And then we wrapped up the session with some discussion around home repair. There's a lot more to discuss there as well. We're happy to provide additional resources, point to other models that are out there that you could take a look at. And then we wrapped up the session with the innovative and supporting housing models, including some conversation around legal services, which we've seen pop up in various conversations and work around the country. So we want to kind of get going here with just the discussion, just a recall. What was most compelling to you in terms of the housing models? Maybe some that you have experience with and you didn't know, kind of some additional details, or maybe some that you hadn't really considered. Can you just put in the chat kind of what you found compelling? What did you learn that maybe you hadn't thought of before, just so that we could get a sense for where you are and what you're thinking? So Elizabeth, I think that that's maybe coming in the chat functions.
It will be again once I believe the attendees again are on a slight delay after us, and I will be watching for that to come into the Brand Live chat, and we'll post here as well.
Great, thank you. Just to get you all starting to think about how this all connects to the work that you're doing on the ground, and certainly give you an opportunity to share with folks that may not know the work that you're doing. So please feel free to share in the chat. There doesn't seem to be anything coming in quite yet. So why don't we just move on to the next. The SRO was interesting, is what someone said. So thank you for whoever it was that participated. That's good. Quick check, Kevin, anything else coming in through the chats?
Nothing at the moment.
Okay, well, let's move on then. As we said earlier, we're going to go to the long-term housing solutions. We walked through them in specifically in the last session, so I'm not going to go through every single one. You will see each of these addressed in the course of the next couple of hours. So with that, let's go to the next slide, please. All right, so here's another chat opportunity. What are your most pressing long-term housing challenges? What approaches have you taken to address them? So you could answer both, you can answer one or the other, but please let us know kind of what you're thinking, where you are, what the state of affairs is with your housing programs at your municipality or county. or even state level, since that's where most of you are right now. And bear with the system, it has a little lag. So Kevin and or Elizabeth will let us know what's coming in. What are your most pressing long-term housing challenges? For those of you that have some time under your belt doing this work, what approaches have you taken to address them? So we have Kimberly Ham, acquiring property within the HUD defined limits. Affordable housing generally. So really keeping those program requirements at the top of mind and making sure that that's fitting with your strategy of acquisition of housing. Affordability. Yeah.
Madeline, I just wanted to weigh in on that first one, you know, about acquiring property within the HUD defined limits. You know, we all have a different situation in which we find ourselves. Some of our communities have, you know, housing that's pretty reasonably priced, and, you know, other communities, you know, the housing market's hot and things are up. And so those are all the kinds of things, you know, that Michael was talking about in the first session that you need to understand in terms of understanding the data and what's going on within your local environment, to help you to make good decisions about how you can best use your dollars.
Thanks, Doug. We have a couple more things that came in. Another challenge is keeping people housed. There are some innovations around that, including using housing navigators. We have heard housing navigators being used across the country in various places. So thanks for that. Housing availability, affordability, certainly. Zoning challenges. That's another one that comes up frequently. Lack of affordable units, lack of home repair funds. Matthew talked a little bit about how to think about structuring some of those home repair funds. So maybe that's something we could follow up on. Not enough rental housing and prices that have increased 10 to 15%. Certainly something we've heard a lot about lately. And the housing stock, having housing stock available, and the housing stock that is available, not adequate. Supportive services. So a lot around availability and a lot around affordability.
And we can talk about how to think about some of the capital stacks necessary to make that possible in some of those cases as well as we go through this.
Yeah, and you know, somebody else just put in a pool of developers. That the capacity constraints around development certainly are real. Thank you for that. Qualified contractors as well, and the aging housing stock for sure. There are many challenges with that that we've seen repeatedly. But as Doug mentioned, as we walk through this presentation, we'll address some of those, and certainly there will be time to discuss those along the way. So thank you for that. We're going to move to the next slide now. And the first model is permanent supportive housing, and we're going to hand it over to Michael.
Thank you, Madeline. I have a fair amount of professional experience in my 25-year career as both a developer, a funder, a regulator of permanent supportive housing in the Northeast. So I'm just happy to take this segment. In January of 2020, HUD released a annual point-in-time survey and determined in January there were 520 in January 2020 there were 580,000 homeless or at risk of homeless people in the United States. That data point also includes the sheltered homeless, but we assume that the 580,000 that was released in terms of a point-in-time data was probably an undercount given the current conditions we're facing with COVID and all the stresses and strains in the marketplace. This is homelessness has, based on data, has increased. And one of the indicators, of course, has been, or one of the causes has been the challenges associated with COVID and rental instability. And we think it's only going to it'll be magnified over the next 24 months. So, one of the solutions to homelessness has been for over 20 years the permanent supportive housing model, which has been termed to be a cost-effective way to house the homeless. Although the capital costs, the operating costs would appear to be expensive, it is far cheaper to house homeless people and to keep them well housed and provided with some modicum of services, which really eliminates emergency room visits, 911 calls, social service calls, taking folks off the street into kind of safe, affordable, sanitary housing really eliminates other costs in a municipality. And there's numerous studies which show there's kind of long-term savings associated with permanent supportive housing. So again, just a fundamental definition, which I'm sure is known to everybody on the call. It's housing with it's permanent housing. People have a long-term lease. They sign a lease. It looks and feels just like any other lease. And services are provided by a service provider with people with disabilities or other special needs. And those social services vary from project to project based on the capacity and the market and the needs in your communities. They vary widely, so there's no one-fits-all description. What's really vitally essential is supportive housing is a challenging form of housing to construct, develop, manage, and maintain. So a developer, if you're looking at this, make sure you identify a developer with prior experience in developing permanent supportive housing. And with that, you should have a local emphasis on the local mental health or service agency to provide those services. You may have a very strong developer. They say they'll provide services. Probe and dig into that more carefully to make sure that they actually have expertise and capacity to do both. So the primary issue with the capital stack is really associated with the operating side of the project. They have construction subsidies needed to look and feel like other affordable housing projects. What's really not articulated here in this chart is the dollars needed to provide services and rental assistance. So you can go to the next slide, Madeline. Matthew, sorry. So the big questions for you, if you make a determination based on the data that the permanent supportive housing is a need in your community, and there's a gap in kind of meeting this critical need of providing permanent supportive housing, as maybe you have transitional shelters, maybe you have a local city mission in your community, but there's no or limited permanent supportive housing. You want to know, do you have project-based or HAP contract capacity? You want long-term rental assistance because this population will be serving is unlikely to have long-term permanent income in the form of from employment because of their condition, because of their homeless status. So secondarily, if you have a continuum of care in your community, have you coordinated with your local continuum of care if you serve on a municipal or county level? You're having the cooperation and assistance from a continuum of care is very significant from a strategic level, but they also do provide some minimum amount of fund for acquisition or construction funding. And it could also provide you with vital dollars for social services. So after making sure you have a rental assistance subsidy in the form of hopefully Section 8, make sure you've coordinated with your local COC. And communities I've been working with over the years, that's usually led and run by local social service agencies. So within that COC community, is there a high quality service provider you know and respect that can operate this property? That's really critical for you. So just know in your due diligence, and when you're looking at a project or trying to initiate a project, make sure you have a partner in a social service provider. And of course, kind of redundant here, make sure you got an operating source to pay that social service provider. You may have a great provider, but there's no operating assistance to pay for their services. Their services don't come for free. They have overhead, salaries, and expenses associated with making sure they operate and support a building. So do you have a county program, a state program? Is there philanthropy that you could set up a sinking fund to support the services? I think they vary widely from state to state, jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but again, it doesn't come for free and you need an operating source to pay for those services. Matthew, next slide. So just here's a quick poll. Having a property manager with specific experience in this is really critical. So if you were to do your due diligence on a property manager, what would you want them to be familiar with? A, record keeping and reporting requirements for CDBG, for instance, for housing, conditions of windows. How would you answer this question? Can we have our production side kind of take the poll, open up the poll?
And while those results are coming in, Michael, we got a question. How do you define long-term social services? 5, 10, 15, 20 years?
That's a very good question. Typically, it should extend the duration of the requirements associated with the subsidy financing. So if you have if you have a regulatory agreement in your property usually these regulatory agreements are of long term. You're certainly going to want them to be coterminous with the length of time associated with your debt and your subsidy programs. So let's define what we know what it can't be. It can't be short term. It can't be annual renewals. I operate in the state of New York, and New York has been innovative in making sure they have long term subsidy sources that go for as long as 30 years. And other states know that you're going to have it coterminous with whatever subsidy source that's out there. So I think it may vary.
Mike, just to echo what you're saying there, and to the attendees' point, the support or operating capital for supportive housing is the most challenging type of capital to raise, I would say, in the affordable housing sphere. Do you want to talk a little bit about kind of how states look to partner with other state funders, whether it be mental health offices, homeless service offices, Office of Veteran Services, Medicaid, in order to drive those operating dollars?
Sure, Matthew, that's a great point.
Thanks.
So on the social service side, in most states, unfortunately, right, the social service dollars do not flow or would not necessarily flow through your state housing agency, your state affordable housing agency, your HFA. So for instance, as Matthew noted, you can, if you're programming your project towards veteran services, you might be able to identify long-term operating support from your local state veteran services agency. Or if it's mental health services that you're providing, you would go to your Office of Mental Health. Harmonizing and capturing these resources on a schedule that's relevant to development is usually a very challenging issue, because you'll have RFPs and requests for submissions from these various agencies, whether it's temporary disabilities or Office of Mental Health Services, whatever it may be, that may not synchronize that conveniently with your HFA's requirements. So that's where the art comes in. It's not science, it's really about art. And in, like many things in life, right? Housing development is about having long-term relationships with your state partners, whatever agency that may be. So, again, they vary widely from state to state. In the Northeast, where I've operated most of my career, there's a number of state agencies throughout the Northeast that, Office of Mental Services, Office of Temporary Disability Services. Again, they just issue their own resources independent of the development schedule associated with the HFA.
It's
So-
also been my experience, Michael, that, oftentimes these things are initiated by an agency that's their primary thing, is offering services and addressing the needs of the population that is out there. And in that case, it often then is up to them to find a good developer partner, as well as municipal partners for funding to make that work. I'm working with a group right now, the YWCA in Hamilton County, or excuse me, the city of Hamilton, Ohio, and Butler County. And they're the ones that initiated the concept to create more permanent supportive housing. They formerly ran a domestic violence shelter and a homeless facility, and so this is something that they have a lot of expertise in and brought to the table on the ground floor, but they had to have other partners to actually get the development done.
That's a good point, Doug. In my career, I've converted a number of historic legacy YMCAs, YWCAs into permanent supportive housing. There were legacy properties located in your central business district that used to accommodate short-term tenants and obviously have gym facilities, and they often lay out nicely for permanent supportive housing. So for those of you who have these facilities in your community that may be mothballed or underutilized, it's a great resource for permanent supportive housing.
So also, just to add to that, as a municipality, when you're looking for affordable housing, supportive housing in your jurisdiction, where it doesn't already exist, and you're looking for the universe of people to reach out to, I would say think of affordable housing developers and supportive housing developers like a square and a rectangle situation. As you're seeking developers, you will find supportive housing developers that also develop low income housing, but you rarely find low income housing developers that just dabble in supportive housing, right? It's a very specialized type of housing. It's not something you want to kick to your local CDC who's never run a supportive housing project before, especially, or I would say certainly not before thinking of really long and hard about the property manager and their experience with tenants. Just to finalize and put a bow on this, the tenants in these projects are generally amongst the most vulnerable populations that your jurisdiction is going to deal with, from matters of emergency room crowding all the way through nights in jail, emergency room visits, mental health holds. So the specialized nature of housing these folks, one, goes to both the safety and security of your residents, which is paramount, but that track record is going to go directly to the heart of addressing what already is, you should already know is going to be selling a real sell you're going to need to do for the community to avoid NIMBYism that comes along with supportive housing projects once you start venturing outside of housing for seniors aging in place. So
to pick up where Matthew left off, like not only do you need a specialty developer with prior expertise in assembling and executing on projects, but you also need a property manager. And that the last question was you need all of the above, right? You need someone not only to make sure that the windows are operating and the plumbing and electrical services is operating, and that you have the day-to-day management of a property in play, but you need someone with specialty experience, making sure they understand the long-term commitments associated with financing a project. So all the paperwork and due diligence and income certifications is associated with CDBG and the like. Those are all requirements that are needed. It's a specialty trade. It's not your vanilla property manager who will be well suited for this long-term permanent housing property management.
Thanks, Michael. And just to wrap up the previous poll, the majority of you got that answer correct. It's all of the above. So moving on to rental rehab, wanted to touch on the major points here and talk through the capital stack so that we can move to the next pieces here. So I think this is Matthew.
Thanks, Madeline. So the first thing I'll mention is, as we go through some of these modalities, you will see the capital stacks, particularly around multifamily rental, will be similar. Don't let that get you excited, because there are still lots of differences between all of the different typologies that we're going to discuss that vary beyond those capital stacks.
And Matthew, I'd like to state that, again, if you want to dig more into these, you could look to the housing guide that will be published and with a lot more detail than here. Here, we're just going over the main points of each typology.
Correct. So long-term rental rehab, when you think about that, what we really are talking about is preservation in a couple of different manners, right? Preservation of either from the lens of existing building stock, from a piece of what we call naturally occurring affordable housing, which is just multifamily housing that, due to the demographics or the building profile, is only able to achieve what we would consider a rent, or HUD would consider is a rent that would be affordable to, you know, those between 80 and below area median income, and generally does that with no subsidy, right? So you have in your universe, you have your Main Street buildings with ground level retail and small amount of properties above. You also have large apartment buildings on the entire spectrum of income, from from very, very poor to very, very luxury developments. Here, obviously, we're talking about CDBG and focusing on units that will be from 80% and below. But the universe of buildings in which you can target, if they're vacant, to acquire and renovate, to convey, are these types of buildings, right? So long-term rental rehabs can be done in a couple of different ways. They can be done with code enforcement officers to relieve problem landlords from their properties. It can also be done when cities take or jurisdictions take titles to buildings through tax or other municipal arrears, and then are conveyed either through a standard program, which gets them into the hands of nonprofit developers, or through an auction if it's a foreclosure issue. Long-term rental rehabs also have the ability to target neighborhoods on a large scale. They're generally a dense form of housing, which affects a much broader spectrum of people than a one-family house. So by targeting one building, you can really drive change on a block. And the other type of thing you should also consider, and we're going to break this down in the next slide, but there are also single-family scattered site multifamily projects in which you can either acquire or take title to a group of single-family houses that you move as one project So,
Hey, Matt,
yes.
I just wanted to weigh in with another thing that I have sometimes seen done with this rental rehab approach is to provide funding for materials to small property owners and who want to maybe do the rehabilitation work themselves. And this offers an opportunity for them to bring those houses up to a better standard and to do so at low cost to them. But of course, you have to manage that by making sure that the houses are indeed brought to a standard, that they have good receipts and so on, that you're reimbursing them based upon and such. So as with anything, it has to be managed, but it can be done on a small scale, even in very small communities.
Thank you.
Just to add, I think the practical reality, not knowing exactly what the distribution of the attendees and where they're coming from, I suspect in many of the locations that you operate in, that the practical reality is that real estate has become a precious commodity, and even in weaker markets, you'll see that there's a lot of trading that's occurring with multifamily housing. So 10 or 15 years ago, when you could pick up properties, I think it's a challenge now to find and identify properties for acquisition, given the fact that it's a scarce commodity and the returns are great. So we're aware of that, but know that this is a strategy, but it fluctuates given the market conditions in your community.
Yeah, that's right. And if you think about the paradigm that was, after the 70s and 80s, where municipalities ended up with just tremendous amounts of real estate inventory on the books, followed by the passage of the low-income housing tax credit, and what was that, 1986, and then the subsequent massive push to get those properties off the books and back onto the tax rolls, has had kind of a, I don't want to call it it's not really a fallout, right? Because there are a lot of benefits that came from that. But the result of that is that cities, one, generally do not have large stocks of buildings to convey for nonprofit multifamily use, let's say. And two, so that pushes multifamily developers into more, competing against against the market for property acquisitions, and it pushes really the concentration of these projects into what we would call cheaper tertiary areas. It is a real challenge. So especially, and I'll say, especially because especially the subsidy requirements, especially like the low-income housing tax credit, will require you to be, in proximity of all of these things like walkability, and so there are lots of just real discussion points I think we should hammer home before we move on to the discussion kind of that dovetails with this, which is scattered site. Know your owner. Rehabilitation experience is key, especially if it's a tenant in place, a building with tenant in place. Once you're moving tenants around during construction, especially older folks, you have to have somebody who is really good with relations and managing that in a very personal way. Overruns on existing properties and renovations are really, they just happen when you are not starting from scratch. You'll see most state agencies put 10% hard cost on rehabilitations, even if they only allow 5% for new construction. This is really because once you start pulling things down, you don't know what's behind walls. Really, before you as a jurisdiction or any of your nonprofit, for-profit, affordable housing partners get into a title chain of a property, you really want to take stock of the environmental condition of that project. Phase 1s and phase 2s will probably be required. I would certainly recommend them if you're going to end up in the title chain of a building or property that that lives forever. So make sure that your engineer and contractor has really done their due diligence prior to groundbreaking. And then, as we're going to talk about consistently, and especially in legacy areas with very old housing stock, lead-based paint, asbestos, pipes, mold, other hazards are going to dramatically raise the cost of any proposed rehab, and need to be accounted for upfront. And as I mentioned, moving around tenants for a rehab is not only challenging, sometimes you have to bribe people, sometimes you have to pay them to move. All three of us in a situation where there is less constraints for time could give you examples of individual tenants who, let's say, are overhoused. Let's say, you know, kids moved out and now grandma has a 3-bedroom to herself because, you know, her adult kids are now married and have moved off. When a rehab comes along, grandma is not going to be put back in that 3-bedroom apartment by herself.
And I think that, Matthew, that's a really, that point is about relationship and trust building in a community too. And offering people, first of all, helping them understand and having those conversations with them about why things maybe need to shift a little bit, and really building the trust that you do have them in their best interests in mind. So it's not so much, you know, kind of, you know, necessarily paying them or anything like that. It's more about having that conversation and offering them different alternatives than perhaps they have seen in the past, and just giving them the confidence that you will deliver on what you are saying you will. So there is a lot of trust building that has to happen in these communities, and there's also the program regulations, right? And being good stewards of federal dollars and making sure that whatever program design and whatever approach you take are hewing to the program rules and regulations. And there are reasons for you having to do certain things when it comes to addressing certain program designs. So just wanted to make sure that that's clear. So we should move on to the next housing model, which is long-term rental and scattered site.
That really dovetails on to the same discussion that we were just having about multifamily apartment building, but it really just expands what we think of as multifamily housing. And this has become increasingly popular model since the 90s of aggregating congruous houses, either homes that have been abandoned or foreclosed, or homes that have been put through acquired through a community land trust or through a land bank, put together into one special purpose entity and moved for the purposes of financing as one project. This is a really challenging model, particularly once geographies start getting more and more spread out. Once you start moving from, let's say, a neighborhood in a city, or a small city specific or a town specific scattered site project, and start thinking of a countywide project. You know, investors particularly, but also state housing regulators and the groups that you're relying to manage these and own these projects are going to start getting more and more skittish because operating those projects becomes more and more impractical. To put a real fine point on that, when you have a apartment building with 50 apartments, you still have one boiler and one roof. When you have a scattered site project with 50 houses, you now have to manage 50 roofs and 50 boilers and maybe 100 bathrooms, all in separate places, with no economies of scale, right? Unless you already have a substantial portfolio. So scattered site rentals can certainly be transformative, but there are many challenges.
Let me just add, Matthew, that there are a lot of different kinds of things that you can do to try to help to improve that situation. However, for example, you can try to standardize things like, you know, the faucets that are in the portfolio that you have, or you can try to, you know, improve the geographical proximity, or you know, many different standardization techniques that can take place across that portfolio. I should also mention that we did some study on this with NeighborWorks several years ago, and actually put a business model together if anybody's interested in looking at more of the details on some of those things we just mentioned. But you know, these are very management intensive in their approach, and definitely take extra time.
Thanks. I want to address one of the questions from the chat, which is if I said drive people or bribe people. I certainly did not say bribe folks. What I was describing is a situation where you have, let's use New York City as an example, where you have a tenant who is refusing to relocate. Sometimes what happens is that tenant will be given a lump sum of money. This is perfectly legal and acceptable outcome, $50,000. This is a sliding scale. In New York City, the payments are much higher for situations like this. But again, in a place with a very high barrier of entry and place with a very high construction cost, sometimes what happens in a project that has never been rehabilitated and has a large aging in place population is that you have folks that are overhoused who do not want to move. And I was just suggesting that there are completely legal, non-bribing ways to relocate folks who otherwise do not intend to participate in a development. I apologize for any confusion on that at all. I hope I've addressed that. Is everyone cool with that explanation?
Yes, thank
Doug,
you.
we had a great question about tying back renovation, or the renovations able to meet the tieback requirements. Are you able to kind of speak to that a little bit, Doug?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that there are some elements of a broad renovation of property that would be difficult to pay for with COVID money. That's, I think, the question is responding to. One idea would be to use your COVID tieback requirements through the CDBG-CV program to do those things that are related to COVID. You know, for example, you could do your lead-based paint and mold and HVAC systems, maybe replacing the roof because you've got water coming in, infiltration that's also related to the mold issue. So there are many things that you can tie back, but then use other funds, for example, maybe your home dollars to address some of the other areas. So you don't have to be tied to one funding source, and often takes, as you can see from the capital stack, multiple sources to get these projects done.
And it also takes multiple funding sources on both sides of this capital stack. It can often require development subsidy and also require tenant subsidy, where a tenant will be in need of a voucher, or in order to move a tenant into a property, that property will have to be renovated up to HQS, or the standard that comes along with taking that payment, right?
And you also have to think about, you know, the needs of your proposed tenants, you know, in terms of services and amenities and those kinds of things.
Absolutely. As we mentioned before, both mortgages, lender costs, operating costs are all much more challenging with a scattered site model. Tax credit prices generally are lower. Investors generally don't like the model as much. That being said, it is often the most transformative way to change a entire block, or to move in a geographic neighborhood that does not have a multifamily stock, but still is in need of renovation. Mike, you were going to say something.
Yeah, just one quick point. I think it's interesting when we talk about the tieback requirements. If you're operating in a county or a municipality that's a high performer relative to HUD, and you have great working relationships with your regional offices and HUD Central, I think you'll note that you'll all realize that there aren't bright line tests that are applied to these rules. So there's variations from region to region and locality to locality, which, you know, begs the point. It's really critically important that you have good operating relationships with HUD oversight, because I think they're willing to tolerate and accommodate high performers relative to tiebacks, and make and stretch arguments in order to accommodate a good plan that's connected to the data. So the takeaway here is work with HUD, develop good relations, be a high performer, so that they'll look kindly and look favorably upon requests that are within reason. I think that's really the takeaway.
And
Yeah,
I would add
that's
to
right.
that, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Doug.
I would add to that, it's really important to have some good local partners. You know, it's your nonprofits within your community that have developed that expertise in managing housing and some of those other services and things that are necessary to make this successful, that have to be fostered and have to be fed and have to be managed over time to make this successful.
Yeah, and I will also add that relationship with HUD is critical. They are there to help and to help navigate through some of these issues and talk through them. So it's important that HUD is seen as a partner in this. This is a relatively new program. They have a lot of really good guidance that is already available on the HUD Exchange. You could go to the Ask a Question desks and the frequently asked question resources, because there's a lot that has been covered to date on the finer points around eligible activities that you could look to. So just following up on Michael's point that HUD should be seen as a partner in this. They want these programs to succeed. They want these programs to address the challenges of COVID in your communities. And then I'll also add that this whole webinar, this session in particular, is a lot broader, because realizing that there are multiple housing sources of funds that need to go into these projects. So certainly we want to make sure that we have the CDBG-CV and the tieback at top of mind, but we also are talking a little bit more broadly. And so we have a couple of questions that have come in. Is the timeline for emergency rental mortgage and utility payment assistance a hard 6-month one? What conditions, if any, need to be met to extend up to a year? And we covered some of that in the first in the first session, so we could double back some of the answers there. And then follow up, what is the deadline to have all funds committed and expended? Doug, I think you answered the first, the
Yeah, I'll come back to that question real quick. 6 months is the limit. And as we mentioned in the first session, you can include some arrearages in that, but it is a hard limit. There is no provision for extending that to a year, as you're suggesting. So you would have to go to other funding at that point. That's under CDBG-CV we're talking.
Okay, let's go to the next slide, which I think is a poll. So go to your Slido down below this main screen and answer which of the following long-term housing solutions is particularly challenging and expensive due to the lack of economies of scale.
We promise this isn't a trick question just because everything is all of a sudden 33% more expensive. I'll just say it's interesting to think about this question in the context of there are lots of places where, you know, brand new stick build construction can be cheaper than renovating an existing structure, and then completely the opposite as well, given you know, depending on the type of market and housing types in a specific location.
So Matthew, do you want to go over the answer and expand a little?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, right, you could make perhaps some cases for any of these, particularly answer D, given you know, a market, but pretty much universally, the answer is C, scattered site rental. As I mentioned, from a property management perspective and the development perspective, it brings additional challenges that you don't face with a multifamily building modality. And just briefly, I talked about you know, having 50 boilers and 50 roofs, but you also have to have your staff be able to travel to 50 houses. You have to, and you know, if two boilers break on the same night, you know, it's not easy if a heat is down in let's say where the heat is down in a building and you can fix it for an entire building. You know, if electricity goes out, you know, you have 50 houses complaining, or if, you know, you're multiplying your issues by 50. The other side of that is that from an income perspective, you know, you are going to have 50 tenants with 50 different houses, perhaps 50 different rents depending on the types of units. It really drives complexity into projects.
Thanks, Matthew. The next, there was a question about having written materials that you could print. Yes, there will be a guide released later this year, as well as all of these materials. So there will be the availability of this after the session. So the next slide, please.
I do see that we have a question here about housing homeless persons and dealing with rent burden and others with housing and instability concerns such as substandard conditions, other at-risk factors constitute sufficient CDBG-CV tieback. I think that it can be a tieback if there are folks in a homeless or potentially homeless situation. I think where it gets complicated or difficult to make that tieback, though, is when you're talking about doing long-term development. If you're going to be starting maybe to develop new housing that is going to be, 3-4 years in the making, I think it can become a little more difficult to make that argument that you're addressing that short-term need around homelessness. Whereas you might have some other solutions that could address that more timely and effectively. So I think you have to think through that very carefully. Others on the panel may have different viewpoints.
Agreed, Doug. And I think that, again, to the point before, that you should be working with your local or regional HUD representatives to help work through some of these issues, and also just take full advantage of the resources that are already available in terms of answering some of the nuances related to the tieback questions. But there is the expectation that there are going to be questions about these, and to the extent that HUD has received these questions, they've been answering them and putting the resources on the HUD exchange for you to look at. So for this next part, we're going to look at long-term rental for new construction, multifamily, and Michael will lead us through this discussion.
So advantages to start with when you come to long-term rental new construction, your ability to price out a project is relatively easy as opposed to a rehab, because you're not dealing with a pre-existing condition and the unknowns of what happens when you crack open a building and get behind the walls. Here you're able to fully price out a project, presumably because you have a clean site and because the development costs would be easy to price out and easy to estimate. I do want to raise one caveat in that, hopefully if you're going to do new construction, hopefully you're working on a clean site that doesn't have any brownfields or any environmental remediation, because that would challenge what I just said a moment ago, which is that it can be difficult to price these projects. So assuming you got a clean site that's not contaminated or has any unknown environmental conditions, this is attractive for your ability to fully price out a project. With that said, there are extreme, it's expensive. You all know intuitively it's expensive to build a new building as opposed to renovating an existing shell with an existing structure, floors, and foundation. Here in this project, you're doing soup to nuts, foundations, superstructure, all the elements of a project, mechanicals, electrical, plumbing, all those systems are going in. So know that this is an expensive proposition and you'll need soft subsidy. One of forms we could use, of course, is the CV dollars that we just discussed. Perhaps the biggest challenge besides financing the project will be obviously community support. We haven't talked a lot about community support, but locating affordable housing in many of our communities we know to be challenging, particularly those of you who operate in the municipal level. You work in communities where people think that their community should be permanently preserved in the form that it is right now. They want no new development. And so it can be very challenging. There's no silver bullet when it comes to community buy-in or zoning. It varies so widely from state to state, jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and control. But obviously that's a huge factor that really is outside the four corners of this presentation. Know that you need to work hand in glove with your zoning officials and the local community to get local buy-in. So just quick little description here that this you've seen a variation of this capital stack. Let me just point you to the capital sources, right? You're going to have construction subsidy, the senior debt, and undoubtedly with new construction, you're going to have a development finance gap because it'll be $200,000, $300,000, $400,000. It could cost that much to build a unit. Know that we'll have to accommodate and build in the costs associated with administering these funds, as Doug noted previously. Davis-Bacon wage rates, cost of compliance. These are all expenses that are going to have to be borne by the contractor and the developer. So those are additional costs that add up inside that development finance gap. So it's likely you'll be using other sources of financing, home, or maybe even tax credits. We can go to the next slide. Developing new construction, developing a site is a long-term proposition. We know it takes time and it's complex to develop multifamily residential housing. It takes time, it takes commitment. So it could take, many months. It could take as long as years to do projects in order to assemble the site, get full site control, get it fully permitted, and lining up all the financing. So you're going to need a development team and a plan that's going to stay in place with you. And you have to have the fundamental economics behind you to make that work. Know that it takes a team to develop multifamily residential projects. You need architects, general contractor, consultants, lenders, financiers. Well, they're going to need you, the municipality and the county, to make sure that provide you with capital sources to make it work. So, one thing to contemplate and think about, of course, is the funding gaps which are necessary, which will be identified, of course, after you get the fully cost to develop the project, you'll see what gap you have relative to the sources you're able to get approval for. Know that, for instance, tax credits can take a long time and multiple rounds. It would be, it takes a long time, and there's high barriers of entry typically in many markets for tax credits. Tax credits are usually provided to developers that have prior experience with tax credits. So know that a good, high quality team that has prior experience working together, it takes time, takes effort, and could take a long time. Make sure you're I say this particularly to the municipalities and counties. If you're going to back a team, make sure there's a pre-existing relationship with those team members. If you get funders, if you get developers coming to you looking for financing, make sure you evaluate that team to see if they can execute that project. Of course, utility services and amenities have to be considered in these projects. We know affordable housing is a needed commodity, but these projects have to be appealing, have to be attractive for the long term. We want to make sure we don't create obsolete projects or projects that go obsolete in a few years. Having a proper amenity, so making sure you have Wi-Fi, making sure you have laundry services in the basement, putting in good quality finishes will add to the long-term value of the project, and make it easier to care and maintain. So again, having marketability as a concept for long-term affordable housing is essential and should be considered. To that end, having a good market study may be essential, may be required in the market you're working in order to obtain financing. A good quality market study is very helpful to see exactly what your capture rate is in terms of leasing and what the available market is for affordable housing. I'm sure in many of your locations, there's a demand for affordable housing, but getting texture, color, and detail about what that looks like is really important.
I want to take a moment and bring us back to the earlier conversation we had about understanding your data and your need within your community, and then trying to maximize the use of your local resources to make that those dollars that you have go as far as they can. And I want to give an example of where I've seen that happen, and then there are many that we could give, but the city of Lima, which is a small entitlement community in Ohio, they were using their home dollars for just doing a handful of rehabs. They only got like I think it was $250,000 a year for that program, and they would do 2 or 3 rehabs a year, and that's all they were getting out of those dollars. And they determined that they wanted to do something in their downtown because they really needed better quality rental housing at a much larger scale than they were achieving, and they needed it in the downtown area. They also wanted to do something to stimulate their economy down there, and they were able to take those 2 years of those home dollars and leverage them using low-income housing tax credits, using historic tax credits, both local and federal, and some other funding sources to renovate what had been a historic bank building in the downtown. And they ended up with commercial space. They ended up with some market rate units. They ended up with 47 units of affordable rental housing. And they achieved much more with those 2 years of funding than they were able to achieve in the way that they've been using it. So giving some extra thought and time to really plan how to best use those resources can be valuable.
Thanks, Doug. And just some additional questions for consideration, right? Particularly for those of you operating for the 50% or greater, operating in a county or a municipality, make sure that there's coordination and consideration of your existing consolidated plan, which you file annually, with whatever proposal you're identifying for use of these funds. Your consolidated plan should be a living, breathing document that's meaningful, and that's something that should not only tie back for the requirements of CV, but also whatever housing proposal should be connected to your consolidated plan. Again, I think we've reviewed this. I think there's fluidity and flexibility with what forms of housing assistance may meet the individual CDBG-CV requirements of your community. We had a question before, which I thought was somebody posed a question, which is, doesn't housing homeless people dealing with rent burden really sufficient to constitute CDBG-CV? I would make the argument that yes, I think absolutely. But I think the fundamental question is, are you deemed to be, by your local HUD field office and regional offices, to be a high performer? Do you have any audits? Do you have any outstanding issues associated with the administration of your funds? Again, I think there'd be greater tolerance and more flexibility for those offices that perform well and have used their allocations efficiently and according to the regulations. I think there'll be a greater tolerance to look kindly upon reasonable requests. So to that end, I think there's tolerance, there's flexibility, but know that it's going to vary by your relationships at HUD. Again, one question I just want to get to, what does your state or locality provide rental subsidy? Your first stop in a county or a municipality would be at your local housing authority. Housing authorities may have capacity to convert project base into HAP contracts. We know they have some ability to do that. They may have some available project-based Section 8s in their portfolio as well. We know their lists are long. There won't be, I suspect your housing authorities are probably tapped out in terms of this resource, but there could be an occasional few vouchers that are available from time to time.
Or ACTs might be available too, depending on.
That's right. Housing choice vouchers. And lastly, I went over it previously. There's no one size fits all, but does your state, locality provide any service subsidy for permanent supportive housing. Again, it's a really critical question. You know, I again, for you in the state working in municipalities, I really would propose that you communicate to your state, your local HFAs, talk to your elected leaders. You know, there's a reason why they're elected and have this position. They should be a resource for you to contact to ask these kinds of questions. Your local state representatives, assemblymen, state senators, they'll have access to some of this data as well. So those are all resources for you to talk about.
We have a couple of questions in the chat just to make sure we're going through them. There was a question about rental versus ownership, and we will be focusing on some of the ownership models coming up this afternoon in a minute here. This is our last of the rental models. And then we also had a question about it from a COC around bathroom facilities, and those have been an eligible use of CV funds. So we can follow up if you have additional questions about that. But if you go to some of the public facilities questions, FAQs, again, the general FAQs, you will find more guidance there. We have a question around broadband as well, and there will be sessions specifically on broadband, I believe, in terms of the use for fiber and addressing the digital divide. It is something that is of interest to HUD, and they are starting to put out more technical assistance around broadband issues and addressing the digital divide. So stay tuned around more guidance there. And there will be these PowerPoints as well as recording again on the HUD Exchange after this conference. So keep the questions coming in and we'll try to address them to the best of our ability, and we'll follow up if we can't address them here today. So with this last piece on rental, we're going to move, we're doing a quick time check. We're at 12:30. We go to 1:15 on this session. So we're going to spend the rest of the time on this, the owner models, and then doing some polls in between. So with that, I think it goes back to Matthew.
Okay. Yeah, so long-term innovative and supportive housing models can go to many different types of modalities. I think here, because of the outcry we've heard from all across the country, we've tried to focus on ADUs, which are accessory dwelling units. But you know, if we have the time, we can get into you know, alternative ownership models as well. But for here, let's talk about ADUs. Well, the common vernacular prior to the insertion of this into the affordable housing arena, they were called mother-in-law suites, which are essentially small dwellings, almost akin to a tiny house, if you will, that are built in the back lot of a home, generally where zoning would otherwise preclude it. Right, so it gets you a smaller second dwelling, modern day carriage house, if you will. So inherently, if you're moving forward in this direction, you're going to have a willing individual homeowner. You're gonna have to understand your entitlement pathway, meaning if this is anything other than a grant and there's a mortgage outstanding on a house, you know, can I put a second mortgage on the house? Is there already a second? You know, are there, you know, is this a CLT that has a, that is not managed with a ground lease, but with a restrictive covenant, let's say. So there are other, you just need to understand your entitlement pathway through each individual transaction. Similarly, the financial mechanism that you're going to use to build this accessory dwelling unit is going to have to be friendly to existing mortgages. And if you have the fundraising and ability to go beyond a second mortgage in places where you may need to go deeper with a homeowner. Rental assistance and landlord tenant education, especially when the accessory dwelling unit is going to be used for income purposes, is really important. And it's analogous to the type of education that LISC and HUD and your other local housing finance agencies really push when doing small properties where you're going to have a owner, let's say, living on the ground floor and a tenant in the upper. A lot of people, let me backtrack a second, especially and even more so if you're not doing a 1 to a 2, but if you're doing, let's say, you have 2 tenants or 3 tenants, which all still qualify as single family mortgage, teaching a person to be a homeowner and to be a landlord are 2 very different things that need to be combined in order for this modality to be effective. The capital stacks, if you look in the middle of the page, I think they are pretty similar on the income side, meaning that if you stick to not burdening your tenant above 30% of their income, and then you have a rental assistance payment, let's say you don't, you're going to have that be your project gap. That gap can be filled or it cannot. In the cases where it can't, that's where on the right-hand side, where you have project capital, that's where being able to either drive philanthropic leverage to your fund or quite frankly, figure out a grant model. It's really going to be hard to go deep on affordability, but that's kind of part and parcel of the modality, right? You are targeting these dollars to homeowners already, people with existing homes, which I think already kind of skews the AMI coverage higher. So it's already a barrier to entry, but it's also many communities are completely made of single family houses, and it's a very necessary product to be able to reach folks where they are. Just some quick discussion points. Generally, ADUs are accessory structures, but they can be constructed with breezeways or covered hallways that connect. An example is above the garage type situation. Students, extended family, and increasingly, that's been the traditional use for ADUs as the housing crisis has pushed people all across all income spectrums to the edges. This is becoming an increasingly normal source of the housing stock. In a place with older housing, like Rochester, Buffalo, upstate New York, carriage houses have been a normal type of city-based housing because historically, these are rich places with secondary homes behind them, but this is now being brought to a neighborhood near you, and you know, you're going to start seeing these built on smaller and smaller properties, including 100 by 100. You know, a double city lot, something like that can certainly accommodate an ADU. So, yes.
I would just like to add, Matthew, also that I think this is an opportunity to break down some of our local silos within our administration. You know, for the zoning folks, for example, to be having conversations with community development officials in the community, and being able to work on these issues and these problems together.
I think that's right.
Yeah, that's a really important point, the zoning discussion. So while there is, you know, some appetite for exploring ADUs, the zoning conversation that happens at the local level really needs to be dovetailed with the exploration of this as a housing model for affordable housing. And that's happening all over the country, certainly in much more dense communities as well, as Matthew pointed out. Some of
You're also
can happen.
I'm sorry, Madeline.
No, go ahead.
I'd say you're also seeing it as you see it as the way richer, more affluent jurisdictions dip their toes into the affordable housing waters as well, in a way that perhaps is less contentious, you know, than building a 100 unit. A 100 unit, let's say, affordable housing building, typically ADUs for students and empty nest seniors are less controversial.
Right, they are, although the density question does pop up still, and so
Sure.
the that conversation can sometimes be a complicated, long, drug out for many months, if not a couple of years, until the zoning and the housing folks align. So we're going to move on to the next slide. It's on owner occupied rehab.
Yeah, so we touched on this towards the end of the first session, but it's worth listening to it again, and also kind of talking about what owner occupied rehab is. In terms of an existing homeowner that just wants to upgrade their home, there is generally no subsidy source available just for that. That generally has an owner capital component. And the project capital is that owner's contribution, and whatever they can either raise from home equity, first or second mortgage loan, any kind of you know, grant-based assistance they may be able to put together, right? But generally, government and nonprofits and philanthropy aren't in the renovate your house to make it you know, just to upgrade your house beyond imminent needs and repairs. Home repair is a different thing completely, and what we're talking about here is homeowners from various spectrums across the income spectrum, who have either imminent life and safety issues or home repair issues that require some sort of need beyond their ability to pay. So we're talking about imminent needs. I think we've mentioned several times, the very baseline to start is going to be you know, municipal arrears and taxes, and making sure that title is able to be clean, and a support system around just getting folks to that very spot is really important. Not just to get people through your lending program, but to help neighborhoods convey generational wealth to underserved and disinvested communities. Then, I'm sorry, Doug, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, if I could jump in on a couple of things related to owner-occupied rehab, I think it's important to set good policies about what it is you're trying to rehab. You know, when do you walk away from a unit because the costs are too much, or when do you determine that you're not going to provide assistance because they really don't need that much? You have to sort of find that sweet spot in the middle that's relative to the amount of funding that you have available. And you also have to think about this in terms, as Matthew was sort of alluding to, in terms of this is not just for the household that's living in this house. You're also making an investment in that neighborhood, in that housing stock. And you have to think about the impact of that and how you're going to target your resources for maximum effectiveness.
That's right. You could definitely not be all things to all people with a finite source of money. You can certainly, with the right amount of targeted philanthropy, grow the pie. But, you know, because of either title concerns, the inability to get past credit scores, because sometimes you max out of loan proceeds before you can even get to the imminent life and safety issues. You are going to have people that are not eligible really for the program. But as we've seen it, where we've done our major home repair program like Detroit, Michigan, you know, I think you see supports for getting people into the pipeline, supports for people who can't necessarily get into the pipeline now, and you know, guidance thereafter. And then you see, you know, the vast majority of folks. I don't have the specific numbers for you know, approvals and declines in front of me, but you know, I think you know, over 600 homes have been renovated with this program in just a couple of years. So just a couple.
Yeah, I think that the program models, you know, one of the key takeaways is that keep it simple too, is with these program models, so that you don't add too much complexity. You also, you know, we've said this before, that look to see where you could leverage other resources as well, and make sure that you're being strategic about which, you know, where you're placing your CDBG-CV funds. Are there other resources that could touch some of these different housing models? So I think that, you know, this discussion slide just brings up some food for thought for you to consider as you kind of think about this particular type of housing. So I think we're going to move on to the next slide here, which is a poll. What funding source cannot be used for the replacement of a furnace as a home repair? What funding source cannot be used for the replacement of a furnace as a home repair? If you go to your Slido, you can answer. are correct out there in the world. The home program. So moving to our next poll really quickly. A CDBG funded homeowner subsidy for private owner rehab can take the form of a grant, a soft second forgivable loan, an unforgivable loan requiring payments, or all of the above. And it looks like the majority of you are correct, all of the above. So in the interest of time, let's move on to the next part of our housing models presentations: acquisition, rehab, resale.
So this is for all the folks looking for direct tie-ins to, I'm sorry, Doug, did you want to talk?
No, I'm good. Thanks.
Okay. This acquisition rehab has a direct tie for short-term needs, provided you can move through development quickly. So it really depends on the type of homes you're acquiring, the condition that they're in, and your ability to line up labor and materials, and either renters, organizations to manage a renter / lease, or through a home buyer program, right? So a lot of that is easier said than done. Right here, we give the advice to seek to buy homes at a discount. And in places where land banks and foreclosed homes, or I should say, well, let's start with land banks. Land banks, where they exist and have inventory, are often a source of homes at a discount. Some land banks in certain jurisdictions have competing mandates for discounted properties, and really are focusing on trying to keep home values up and properties on the tax roll. So there are really pushes and pulls on abilities to buy homes at a discount. Furthermore, even with foreclosed homes, one of the things that I think is the best practice is to try and negotiate a first look at projects going through either the sales process through the bank's disposition program, or that's coming through a Fannie Freddie special servicer. But those first look programs before what we see now, which is the REITs acquiring these projects for rental purposes. They have very nimble capital and ability to get first look. Really is at this point a paramount. I'm sorry, Doug, you wanted to talk?
No, I just thought that there were a couple of things I thought might be helpful to add here. Part of this too is about targeting your resources once again, and thinking about the fact that your neighborhoods within your community are not all the same. We have neighborhoods that we could classify as healthy neighborhoods. We have neighborhoods that are more tipping point. We have those that are, more redevelopment, where they're really distressed and there's not much going on. And so you have to think about the range of neighborhoods that you have and where it makes sense, both from the perspective of the individual house. In other words, what condition is that particular house in, and is it worth saving? And also about the neighborhood that house is in, and what you're trying to accomplish overall in that neighborhood. What else is going on there? Is there other development activity? Is there, do you have some of your partners that are working there? And are there things that you're supporting by the work that you're doing? Are there amenities? Is there a grocery store nearby? All of those things matter as you're thinking about the viability of the houses that you're going to approach to purchase. But acquisition rehab is a good activity for targeting to really begin to turn neighborhoods around when it's done in conjunction with other activities.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And one of the things, we're often forced with in our communities is creating markets where they don't otherwise exist, right? So in areas where you have old dilapidated housing stock that for the price you pay for it and the cost to rehab it, it's just never going to appraise out, right? It's gonna you're gonna have negative equity, and it outstrips the price of what homes go for in that particular area. We see that all across the country, and especially in places that have been historically disinvested. We see properties in Black communities with similar amenities appraised out for 40% less than similarly placed projects in majority white neighborhoods across the street with the same amenities. And so in certain places, using grant capital or forgivable capital, and being able to either subsidize the purchase price, or on the other hand, subsidize the construction cost, and bring people into neighborhoods and prove that the market exists in order to drive private capital. That is the only way forward in a lot of neighborhoods. So food for thought.
Yeah, and I think that that's really important to underscore that there are lots of complexities around here, around these topics, and that even with municipal governments that are motivated to address some of the dilapidated housing stock or vacant housing stock, you have to find good partners to do this work. And thinking through the timelines for achieving your goals around some of this is important, because you'll need to build those relationships with developers, build those relationships with other funders, build the relationships within your city government, even to make this happen. So we're going to move to the next piece of the agenda here, which is new construction single family, and this is where Doug will lead us through this conversation. Doug.
Sorry about that. Took me just a second to get off of mute, but I do want to mention here, there's a couple of things that we haven't really talked about yet, and one is the fact that when you're talking about home ownership, you're talking about providing housing that people are going to buy, and in order for people to buy housing, they have to be able to make that purchase. And so one of the things that's really important when you're talking about any of these home ownership models is to be able to think through how you're going to develop that pipeline of eligible buyers. The counseling that you're going to provide, and the credit cleanup that you're going to provide, the down payment assistance that you're going to provide to make this possible for any of these models to work. And so that becomes part and parcel of your overall plan as well. This particular model, new construction, can be done in multiple ways. And I would highlight that it can be done at a large scale, where you're building a lot of homes with a sophisticated capital stack and a large developer. It can also be done at a smaller scale. And I think, for example, about Habitat for Humanity and some of the work that they do on the homeownership side. And I would mention there, for example, that when you're talking about a model like Habitats, they can do these with a particular homeowner that's lower income. Typically, for homeownership to work, you've got to be at least 60% of area median income to be able to make the numbers work. But when you're talking about Habitat, where they're going to hold that mortgage and they're going to do volunteer labor and they're going to do other things, they can work with lower income households, and that can be a real benefit to your community to have that model in the mix as well, or something similar to that.
Doug, I just wanted to interject
Sure,
another model that's creeping forward in the new construction arena, which is the manufactured housing advantage projects, and which goes beyond what we traditionally think of the standards of a manufactured housing community, pejoratively known as a trailer home community, for those that have never come across the term manufactured housing. The new manufactured housing advantage standards are very high, and come with a cost that is far below the cost of standard stick-built home construction. And then also, if you want to touch on the way modular is driving single-family home construction costs down at scale, that would be great too.
Yeah, and I want to just point to a chat comment. Someone from Habitat for Humanity just said that they've got a backlog of qualified buyers that they're supporting and helping to find funding. They simply lack enough homes to remodel or land to acquire to do the new build. So I think that speaks to this idea of partnership, and really figuring out who's in the community that could pick up on some of this work and how you could leverage each other's capacity, resources, experience to do the work. So thanks for adding that, Scott. Doug, I'll turn it back to you to complete the slide and move on to the discussion.
Yeah, I see one other question here about deed restrictions. I should mention that CDBG is a little bit different than home. Home's a lot more clear about the need to have a wraparound agreement that covers that affordability period, and that's all very well structured within that program. CDBG is a lot looser in how they define that. So I think it's up to the community to make good decisions about how they're going to approach securing that housing stock for low-income households over a period of time. And I think you need to be deliberate about that and really think through an approach that's going to be effective. And I'm going to go ahead and call that on this slide, and let's move to the next one. Again, there's these discussion questions, and you can look at these in more detail. We're kind of getting a little bit low on time, but there are different types of ownership that are associated with affordable housing, or even with market rate housing, such as condominium ownership or cooperatives, and so on and so forth. So you need to be thinking through some of those kinds of things as well within your community. Next slide.
So this is where Matthew will take us home here with the last housing model that we're going to present, which is a community land trust model. And then we'll wrap up the session.
Yes, and I just want to thank everybody that's managed to stick through all of this juicy housing detail for 4 hours today. Props to you. Let's talk a little bit about long-term housing, kind of outside the more traditional paradigm of either multifamily or fee simple mortgaged private home ownership, which still isn't really unsubsidized because of mortgage interest tax deduction and Fannie and Freddie's secondary market. But even if we go a step further, the way projects are being kept affordable for the long term and really from a neighborhood centric mindset is called a community land trust. And there are a couple different models, right? We're going to talk about really one that has roots in long-term ground lease and ownership of land, and then the buyer or the ground lease owner owning the improvements on top of that land, financed by a traditional mortgage. But there are also models that have, the ownership, the title is conveyed with regulatory agreement or a deed restriction tacked onto it. I think a lot of people are agnostic on those models, and some are very, and some people are very committed to community ownership of the underlying land as the really permanent, driver of permanent affordability. But let's talk a bit about what it takes to. I'm sorry, Doug, you popped up.
I'm just going to say, I've seen where these are used very effectively by some organizations to really secure housing for a long, long time within that community that's affordable.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are also when CLTs own land, they have the ability to drive the creation of amenities on that land to service the neighborhoods where they're building the land trust. So there's a lot of crossover with things like mutual housing associations and other alternative forms of community ownership that really is for a different webinar. We could go into 4 hours of just about that. All that to say, this alternative structure has a couple benefits and drawbacks. The benefits are, you can have long-lasting permanent affordability. Drawback of that is that, your home buyer, or I should say your home seller, when it becomes time to sell that house, is not going to have the same unfettered seller access as an unencumbered home would, right? In some markets that doesn't matter much. In some markets that may drive down the housing cost. If we just go through this model a little bit, I broadly spoke about it. I didn't remember that this chart was forthcoming. So, when you take it away, this chart makes, really puts a succinct lens on one way that you can think about setting up a land trust in your community, particularly, if you're sitting on a lot of in-rem or city-owned property.
Matthew, I'll say that there are a lot of resources out there around CLTs and how to structure them and what some successful case studies have been. And we've worked very closely with organizations that have structured these. So we can certainly follow up with questions about accessing more information on these. So I just wanted to put a pin in that, just being mindful of the time. And so I see, Doug, that you're up. Do you have any additions?
Just that there was a question that came in about co-ops and whether we could provide more resources on that. And the answer is yes, we can. And we're happy to do that.
Yeah, and that's, from a co-op perspective, it could be new construction. It can also be where we see a lot of co-ops in places like, Washington, DC is a traditional model of this, is when an over leveraged project or a project is sold, the tenant has what's called an opportunity to purchase, and the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, TOPA, is a prime way of organizing a building that's being sold into a co-op for perpetuity. Some of them come along with income restrictions, especially if they need subsidy, let's say, to rehab the building. But your use may vary in terms of income targeting.
Thanks, Matthew. Let's move on to the final section of our presentations today. And we're going to ask that you participate in the polls, because it's more of a learning check, a review, and just to get you to think about a little bit what you've seen and heard today. So for this first poll, it's directly related to what we were just talking about. Under community land trust, the CLT, A, sells the land and house with covenant restrictions. B, leases the land to a home purchaser through a ground lease. C, retains ownership of the leased house but sells the land. Or D, none of the above. Okay, it looks like most of the answers have come in, and the correct answer is B. So great job, folks, the majority of folks out there. Let's move to the next one.
I do want to just add real quick,
Yep.
Madeline, that
Sure.
the answer A is also applicable on that as well. We do see community land trusts sell land with permanent restrictions in some communities, but what we don't generally see as C, which is the retained ownership of the improvements with the sell of the underlying land. So
Okay, thanks, Matthew. So for the purposes of wrapping up, we're going to have a couple of slides here, and I encourage you to stay for the last one, which is a word cloud, which will be really interesting, I think, for everyone. But this one is, are there any housing models presented today that you have not tried implementing in your community? A, yes, I'm intrigued by some new ones and we'll see if I can implement them. Or B, no, I've tried them all at various points. So no right answer, just trying to get a gauge for kind of who's out there and what you're doing. Well, that's great. I love to see that there's innovation and people that are curious and learning about more that they can do in their community. So that's great. That's really great. 100%. And some people, I just saw at the very end there that there were a few that they're the old hands at this. So thank you for all of your work in your communities as well. So for this next session, this next poll, do you feel prepared to tackle housing needs in your community? A, yes, I'm ready to go. B, I'm tentative, but I feel like I'm getting the background. And C, not yet, but I'm collecting the tools that I need to do so. So where do you feel you fall here?
Looks like it's a pretty even mix to me, Madeline.
Shift around. Yes, Doug, I'm sorry.
So it looks like it's a pretty even mix to me.
It is. It's an even mix. It's an encouraging mix, I think. We know that there are a lot of folks out there that have a ton of experience. I kind of saw some names there, who's out there, and there are some really great experienced folks, housers out there. But it's really interesting to see that we are seeing some folks that are collecting the tools. And the good news is that through the HUD exchange and through throughout the week this week, you will get a lot of those tools to be able to do it. And we do encourage you to follow up after, because we are all here to help out, to connect you to the resources, and certainly your HUD reps are there for you as well, and encourage you to go to all of the resources that are out there. So interesting mix there. And then this is a slightly different approach. Fill in the blank with a single word in the following sentence to describe the goal for housing in your community in 2022. In the coming year, I hope we can provide housing that is blank for the residents of my community. And I know that it's a big ask to do one word, but let's see what you come up with, and we'll take a look at the word cloud as it forms. Adequate, attainable, affordable. We'll give this a good 30 seconds or so to fill out, because I think this is going to be interesting. Modern, sustainable, available, something that we talked about being a challenge, right? Safe, certainly. Fair, that's a good one. It's a good word to use for your goal. Safe, decent, and affordable, coming back to the basics. Coming back to the basics. Prosperous, yes. Something that people can build their wealth with. Modern, prosperous, adequate, affordable, certainly. Complementary, that's interesting, I like that. Attainable. That's a word that we started to hear more and more. Many of you are still looking to the affordable, which makes a lot of sense. Well, with that, I will thank all of you for participating in this couple of sessions today. I'd like to give a special thanks to our presenters today, Matthew Lieber, Doug Harsney, and Michael Skrabatnis, for sharing their experience with us on housing. There's a lot more, as I said, that you can dig into through the housing guide that will be published later this year. And we look to you to connect with us if you need to, and connect certainly with the resources as I've said before. So with that, thank you to our IT and technical team in the background there for helping us through and troubleshooting this morning. And we hope that you enjoy the rest of the sessions of this conference later this afternoon and throughout this week. Again, remember, basically CDBG is going to be in virtual mode starting on Wednesday, and we hope that you take that. It's a great refresher course for those of you that have been in CDBG for a long time, and certainly a great way to know the program for those of you that are new. So with that, I will say thank you and have a good rest of the afternoon, everyone.
Bye.
Love, strength, and sympathy to the other Buffalo Bills fans in attendance. Have a nice evening.
Yes. Greatest game ever. No matter who won, it was a fantastic game. Thank you.